Hi all, first off, Happy New Year. I just wanted to share an article that I've been writing and I've just uploaded to my blog. I'll put a link to it in the description. I'm not going to read it in this video because I think that there is some value for some things to be in written form and some things to be kind of verbal or in the form of a video or a presentation. And I think that this particular essay is much better in written form for you to kind of peruse or examine or consider for yourself. However, I do want to take this opportunity to kind of broadly go through it and talk about like the key points that I'm arguing, and that might help you to decide if you actually want to read it or not, or if it triggers any thoughts for you. So the title is Against Eternal Life, and that's pretty much what it is, although there is maybe a couple of important qualifications that hopefully I'll touch on as I go through this. So if we just go into it. So yeah, basically my argument is that eternal life isn't actually desirable if we think through that concept, if we think through what the notion actually would mean. We wouldn't actually want it. This is not a kind of new argument. Lots of people have thought of this before. Philosophers have argued this position before, and actually a lot of fiction, particularly sci-fi, has been written around this basic idea that eternal life would not be desirable. So partly I'm kind of drawing on the kind of arguments that have already been made, that are already there. Partly I'm kind of doing my own riffing on that, or adding my own thoughts or my own considerations and arguments to that. So, I mean, it's a strange question to ask, first of all, because I think for a lot of people, I'm not sure what proportion, but for a lot of people it seems self-evident that eternal life is a good thing, that if they had the option, they would want to live forever. Obviously, that doesn't count for people that don't like their life. I'm thinking of people that do like their life, and I'm thinking of an example where we wouldn't have to worry about the effects of aging. You could freeze your life at whatever age you like, and that you would live literally forever, on and on and on. Or alternatively, that maybe eternity means something a little bit different. I'll get to that in a minute. So, but what do we need? Well, let's talk about it now. What do we mean by eternal life? So eternal could mean, and it typically does mean, an infinite duration. So a life like that just goes on and on forever, like the life we live now, but infinitely long. Or it could mean something else. It could have an atemporal sense. So a sense in which in some way we transcend time as we know it and experience it now. So those are the two main types of eternity that I tackle in this essay, and try to show that under each of those understandings, an eternal life would not be desirable. And then finally, what do we mean by life? Well, this is going to get really tricky towards the end, but for now, the life that we're concerned about in eternal life must mean our own lives. So my life, not someone else's life. So that might seem self-evident, but it will get more it will get a little less clear. It will become more important to the argument as it progresses. So the first main section of my essay is dealing with temporal eternity, which is basically that infinite duration. And I refer to an essay by Bernard Williams. I believe that was originally published in the 70s. I think it was the 70s. And and there's a version online, which is what I've linked to here. And so that seems like, at least within analytic philosophy, that is kind of the key essay that sparked a whole debate about would we or would we not want to live forever. I won't go into the details of it. There's a particular reason it has that title. But basically, the key argument is that if we have the same character that we have now, so if our character is constant, as it tends to be within this life, then eternal life would get tedious, would get boring. We would become withdrawn from it. It would not be an enjoyable experience. Eventually, it would become somewhat of a nightmare. So you may have had this thought before, I'm not sure. Again, it's a common kind of trope, but that's the key thing. Because our desires and our interests depend on our character, and assuming that our character is relatively fixed, there will be a time when our desires and interests are exhausted, they're all satisfied, they've all been done too many times, and life is no longer bearable because of its tedium. So how do we get around that? Well, one proposal would be to vary our character. So Williams in his essay, he talks about two examples of that. So one would be that we sort of have a long, infinite series of disconnected lives. There's no connection in terms of memory between the lives. And that has its problems. To kind of briefly, very briefly summarize it, the problem is, why do I care about those future lives? They're disconnected from me, they're different characters than me, they don't have the same interests and desires that I do, so they may technically be me, but they're not kind of me that I care about. And this will be a theme throughout the sort of arguments. The second case is a situation where you actually have a change of character over time, but it's not disconnected, like there's a connection. And so Williams brings this up and he kind of ridicules it a little bit and then he kind of discards it. I think it deserves more attention, so I've devoted more attention to it in this essay. I've spent quite a bit of time going into it and fleshing it out because I think that it does initially at least show some promise, because we can kind of see that within our own lives, within our own finite lifespans, our character does change actually quite a bit. So, and it changes in a meaningful way. It doesn't just change sort of like randomly. It doesn't just suddenly change for no reason. It's not like there's not continuities. But basically, as I grow, my character develops, my interests change slightly. I have slightly different interests. I have maybe deeper interests in some respects, in some areas, and lose interest in others. But basically the idea is my character evolves or my character changes over time in response to what I experience. And so why could not the same hold for someone that lives for eternity? Why could they not grow and develop in the same way, but just for longer? Now, the key problem with that is basically the length of time we're talking about. We're not talking about a human lifetime. We're not even talking about any finite lifetime. We're talking about literal eternity and infinite duration. And so that's problematic. So I've kind of said, let's imagine myself 100 trillion years in the future, and then let's imagine myself 200 trillion years in the future. Is there any connection between these two selves? Any meaningful connection between these two selves? If we put them side by side, they would actually just appear to be completely different selves. Doesn't matter that there is technically a causal connection between the two, that there is technically a connection in memory between the two. Does that actually matter? And, there's a bit of argument here. I won't go over it again in this kind of talk, but my answer is no. Like, it doesn't matter. This is consistent with what Williams argues as well. It doesn't matter that the self that we care about, the life that we care about, is the life, the self with this particular character that we live in this life. This kind of coherent self that, yes, it has some variation in terms of character. Yes, we vary a little bit in terms of our lifespan, but there is a coherence. That coherence would be effectively eradicated in an eternal lifespan. There would be a time when there's nothing uniting what I am then with what I am now, or who I am then with who I am now. And so that's a problem. So that doesn't work either. And then I talk a little bit about something a bit related to this idea of, my particular character, which is the value that finitude, that kind of being limited in time, that having a finite lifespan, the kind of value that this gives my life. And so there's a few ways that it does this. Obviously, the one that we've already talked about is that it enables my desires and interests to be effectively inexhaustible within my lifespan, because my lifespan is limited and my desires and interests, kind of the scope of them is beyond what my lifespan could provide. And so effectively they're not exhaustible within my lifespan. And so that gives my life a sense of value. But there's also this sense of preciousness, the preciousness of life, the preciousness of my life, the preciousness of the lives of the people that I love. They're precious because they don't last forever. These people, including myself, weren't here forever. They're not going to be here forever. They're vulnerable. We could die at any time. The things in my life, again, they are finite. I can't experience them forever, even if they were infinite. So all these kind of things go to the point that finitude, being limited in time, dying, in other words, ending, in other words, gives us a sense of the preciousness of life. It makes life precious. And I quote a little bit from a short story by Borges, which is called The Immortal. It's a famous story. Really good. I'd recommend it. I linked it here as well, so you can read it for yourself. And that's kind of the idea, or one of the ideas that is encapsulated in that story. I also talk a bit about virtue. So, for instance, courage seems to depend on the possibility of death. Sure, we can exercise other types of courage. If we're not going to die, we can, for instance, exercise courage in the face of suffering or discomfort. But is it the same? Is it as grand, as glorious, as important as courage in the face of death? There's something truly noble about that. There's something truly human about that. And there's something truly, let's say, maybe transcendent about that. If we did not have death, could we have that type of courage, that type of virtue? Also, the urgency of virtue in this life, or in life, full stop, if it is the only life. The urgency of virtue. The urgency of virtue being, of course, that, we don't have an infinite amount of time to acquire virtue. We don't have an infinite amount of time to exercise virtue. The things that we do and the ways that we're disposed to the people in our lives actually affects them. They have limited lives too. Everything matters, actually. Everything matters. So far from the sense that nothing matters because we will all die, it's almost the opposite. Everything matters. Everything is important. In a way, these are kind of, in themselves, I guess, kind of common existential tropes, but I think that they are true. I think that they are timeless in the sense of they always relevant to humanity, and they are just true. They're just resonantly true. Another factor is aesthetics. So that's ethics, and how aesthetics also seems to be closely knit together with the sense of finitude. So, if to take just one example, the sense of tragedy, the art form of tragedy, seems like it would be impossible if everyone were immortal. There would be no real sense of tragedy. There would be no sense of, just dying, just ending before our time, or being thwarted or frustrated. Now, and I kind of note that seems a strange thing to consider a loss. But again, if we're thinking of the art form of tragedy, or if we're thinking of other kinds of art forms, or the ways that sorrow, loss, death, ending, all these things participate in great art, a poem or a song that makes you cry. It's not that you just are sad, simply speaking, because then you would just not listen to the song, not read the poem. But it's a sense that these things participate in virtue and contribute to virtue. And so that's basically the idea there, is that our aesthetic or artistic life would be impoverished if we were eternal. So what I've been talking about so far kind of assumes a life that is roughly like the life that we live now. Obviously it's better, obviously we'll be eternally youthful or whatever age we want to be. So there's all these conditions, but basically it's the same kind of life that we live now. So I also consider a few things, a few examples where actually it would be radically different, particularly because we would be absorbed in a highly specific activity or a set of activities. Maybe it's these activities, these experiences that specifically would make eternal life livable. And so I consider a few examples of these. Pleasure, it's not a very good example in a way, but it needs to be dealt with because, we enjoy pleasure, and we could use the word bliss to sort of give it a bit more of a noble feeling about it. But basically, the sense of pleasure, of enjoyment, it seems like this is intrinsically motivating. Therefore, it seems like, just give me bliss forever. And sometimes that's how heaven or the afterlife or eternal life is described, as kind of like bliss forever, only bliss, all bliss. But actually, I think we wouldn't want that. It's not a human life. It's a kind of subhuman life. It's the condition of an animal. We would get tired of it if we continue to be self-reflective human beings. And so it's not a satisfying image of eternal life. It doesn't make me want it. And so next we sort of go to the other extreme in a way. We go to intellectual activity. So what if our eternal lives were absorbed in intellectual activity? In a way, this maybe doesn't appeal to everyone. If you are watching this video about this kind of philosophical question, it probably appeals to you, at least on some level. It certainly appeals to me. But regardless, it doesn't quite work. So we're kind of faced in a way with the same kind of problem. Williams talks about this a bit in his essay on, his original essay against eternal life. He kind of goes into this a little bit. But basically, the idea is that we'd be faced with the same kind of problems. Intellectual activity is kind of seen as, or could be seen as, something that could be totally absorbing, and so we would not be concerned with ourselves. It seems like character wouldn't come into it because it's kind of intrinsically rewarding, and it's kind of grounded in itself. That's how it seems anyway. Williams picks this apart a bit. It says actually it is clearly related, like the actual act of intellectual activity for a person. They're interested in certain things, they'll go in certain directions, like it's clearly related to the character of a person. And so if it's related to the character of the person, then we're left with the same problem we've already explored, which is, well, how do you keep it interesting? If it's totally disconnected from the character and it's sort of like the absorption of the person in this pure activity, well, how does it relate to me, like me as a specific person? Williams says, and I actually like this remark a lot, he says that this activity, this pure intellectual activity, this pure contemplation, could be just as well realized in the existence of Aristotle's prime mover. So basically you could just have this sort of cosmic mind or something like that doing this activity, and that would effectively be just as good as me doing this activity, because both are kind of depersonalized in a way. They don't have a character. So that's the key thing there. Then I come to sort of more religious conceptions, the vision of God, or the being in the presence of God, or being with God. This is and I note that this is a promising approach. This is probably a better approach to sort of ground it in the absolute being, ground it in an infinite being. That seems to be the only really viable way, or potentially really viable way, of grounding eternal life. The problem, of course, is, well, then you have to describe or explain or understand what this infinite being is, what God is, or who God is. Like, that's not an easy question to answer. It's a question that, the human race, we've been debating for thousands of years now. Doesn't seem like it's going to be resolved in any way that everyone recognizes soon. It's a question that I don't consider to have resolved. So to ground everything in God is problematic. And also, I would say that for believers themselves, believers in God, I think that many of them would be ready to admit that, no, we don't understand God. So even if we have faith in God, we don't understand God, and therefore we don't understand how he could ground eternal life, that beholding God in some way intellectually or in some analogous way, sort of having a vision of God, how that actually could be endlessly interesting and endlessly justifying of life. It's a kind of structure that we're talking about here. It's a kind of structure of my finite life, or my limited life is a better way of saying it, can be eternal because it's grounded in the infinite being. Well, what does that actually mean exactly? And unless we can explain God, we can't explain that. And so that depends on God. That's basically what my argument is there. Interestingly, also, God is a personal being. If we conceive God as a personal being, we have many of the same problems that we've already dealt with in this essay, which is, how does a personal being relate to eternity? God is supposed to be eternal. So how does he relate to eternity? Atemporally, temporally, either way we cut it, as we see, it doesn't seem to make sense. And so that itself is a problem, that if we're talking about a personal God, he seems to be undermined by the very kind of questions that we're asking. And so, I do actually, I do see some value in this way of thinking, though. So I kind of talk about in life, in actual life, when I feel vital, when I feel full of joy, when I feel full of love, when I feel kind of assured that everything will be okay, those are the times where I actually find like I have an immense tolerance for everything. Even things that are typically tedious or boring become interesting, or at least they don't bother me in any way. I become more generous with my time, with my attention to people. So there's this sort of transformation that comes from having a sense of vitality, having a sense of joy, having a sense of love. And so it's possible, or it's maybe just conceivable, that God could kind of infuse the vision of God, or the experience of God, or the nearness to God could infuse that into a person, and that could make eternity not only bearable but enjoyable. I might just read this quote actually in this video because I like it so much, and obviously it cuts against what I'm arguing in the majority of the essay. Because children have abounding vitality, this is by G.K. Chesterton, by the way. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again, and the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony, but perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. So I love that quote. My response to it? Well, okay, it's good. It brings out something beautiful and interesting about existence, but maybe I don't want to exult in monotony forever. Maybe I don't want children to exult in monotony forever. Maybe I want them to become grown-ups. Maybe there's a place for children saying, do it again, and for grown-ups kind of moaning at that and doing it again reluctantly. Maybe, in other words, everything has its place and time. That's kind of what I'm arguing with this essay. Maybe it's okay that everything has its place and time. So the second major division of the essay, I'm talking about atemporal eternity, so eternity conceived of as transcending time as we now experience it, not as being sort of in time or an endless duration of time, but as being in some way above it or transcending it. And so there's an analogy there with like mathematical objects, like numbers. Do they exist in time? Well, not exactly, not even at every point in time. It's better just to say that they transcend time if they exist at all, like as real independent objects. So I talk a bit about space-time as well. So, the notion that that time is just another dimension of space, that the universe is a four-dimensional space-time manifold, and so in that sense, everything that is in that manifold just simply exists. It's not like some things no longer exist and some things are yet to exist, but everything just exists. And so another way of thinking about that is that everything is equally present. Everything is equally present, and if there was a God, everything would be equally present to God. The whole thing would be apprehended simultaneously. And so I refer to another paper. This is The End of Immortality, Eternal Life, and the Macropulis Debate. So Macropulis Debate being Williams' original paper. The person who wrote this one, Michael Burley. So he proposes a kind of religious atemporal interpretation of eternal life, basically drawing on what I just said about space-time. The whole of time and space is simultaneously present to God. Therefore, my life is already eternal. Everyone's life in that sense is already eternal. The problem with that is that if it's just that, if I have no access to God's perspective, either now or let us say in the future, if I have no access, then what does that matter? So my life is eternal, but I still experience time within my life flowing. I still experience going from, I still experience the movement of time. I still experience things coming from the future and going into the past. And so long as I experience that, and I can't experience anything else, any other perspective, it's functionally the same. It's qualitatively identical, whether my life is eternal in the sense of four-dimensional space-time, or whether it's simply strictly finite, as in the past ceases to exist. Doesn't matter. My life is the same. And so what do I gain by eternal life? The only thing I could gain is sort of the positive effects of knowing the fact that my life is eternal, which isn't nothing, but it's not like the eternal life itself is valuable. It's the knowledge of the eternal life that could be valuable. And that's an important distinction. Now, so what if we do come to inhabit God's perspective, at least in regard to our own lives? Well, that presents a different problem, or a different set of problems. First of all, what status does our life then have, or what reality does our life then have? So the life that we're sort of viewing from outside, and we're maybe apprehending the whole of it eternally, and simultaneously as sort of like one coherent object in space-time. But is that a life? So I kind of note that, time seems intrinsic to life. Living is something that is dynamic, that is immersive. It's a process, it's a movement into ever new possibilities. But this temporal observing of life or apprehending of life is not like that. The whole thing is already complete. So I say it's potentially just a devitalized image of life. It's not having an eternal life. It's having an eternal image of a life, maybe. And then, of course, there's another question, which is like, who is the experiencer of this? And I would say that not only is sort of life, is time necessary to life or intrinsic to life, but time is intrinsic to experience. So when I perform this thought experiment, when I imagine myself kind of observing my life as a whole outside of time, what am I actually doing? Well, I'm actually imagining an experience that occurs in time. So even if I kind of think, I'm thinking of the whole object all at once, or I'm seeing the whole thing all at once, there's still a sense of time in that experience. So whichever way I look at it, that experience in my mind is a temporal experience. And I would say that that's simply because all experience is a temporal experience. Even if you cite a mystical experience or an insight into timeless eternity, well, the fact that you remember that at all implies that it was something that you lived through, which implies that there was a temporality to it. It implies that there was a this and then a that and then another thing or another aspect. There was a temporality to it. And so I don't think that we can have an atemporal perspective or an atemporal experience of our life. And so finally, some conclusions for this. Obviously, I think that ultimately eternal life in the sense of a personal existence that continues forever, this life that continues forever, it just doesn't make sense. And to the extent that it can make sense, to the extent that it is intelligible, it's not something that I would desire. I don't want complete variation of character endless amount of times, and I don't want the alternative, which is that I could keep the same character but exhaust all my possibilities and then I'm eternally bored. And I can't make sense of atemporal eternity, so that doesn't work either. And if we base the whole thing on God, well, I can't make sense of God, so that doesn't work either. It works potentially if I have faith in God and have faith that I will want eternal life. But that's a very different thing than saying I do want and do understand eternal life. That's a very different thing. So why do we think that we want eternal life? Well, we could say that there's an endless paradox here, that we don't want to die and we don't want to live forever. We're stuck between this choice between two evils. I think an easier way of explaining it is simply that we do actually want life. We want to continue to live. And so generally, most people, most of the time, they fear death and they don't want to die because they've got more living to do. The thing is that we, life is good, but not forever. So what we're saying is a finite life is good. That's the good. A good life that is finite. The reason we fear death, the reason that we think we want to live forever, is because our life could be more. It could be better. It could be more. We're not finished yet. And so the good thing here is the finite life. Not personal life stretched to infinity. That's not a good. We don't actually want that, at least in the way that I see it. And then at the very end of the essay, and this kind of adds more complication to it, and it's kind of a little bit of a tangent, I guess, but I thought I should put it in there because it is important, and it does maybe create a fruitful way of thinking about eternity, about thinking about life. But basically I say that there's two senses of life when we're talking about life. We're talking about life in the sense of life force or act of living, and we're talking about our life. So in the sense of, if I say my life as opposed to your life, these are different lives. These are different self-contained wholes. These are different characters, sets of experience. But then so that's the second sense of life, and then the first sense of life is the sort of the living itself, the thing that underlies the particular life or the particular lives that you could have. And so that's a key distinction here. And the reason that I bring it up is because I think that there is a sense in which we want, or at least I want, on some level, want eternal life or want to live forever. But it seems to me that this comes from that first sense of life, right? So the sense of just living, the life force itself, the process of life itself. This to me seems quite impersonal, even though it's at the core of me in a way, right? It's my life itself, but it's impersonal. It's not personal. The personality, the particularity is afforded by it or supported by it, but it itself is not that personality. And so I could, in that sense, want to live all these different varied lives forever, I could want to, effectively, it comes to a similar thing, be reincarnated forever, even though those lives are discontinuous, even though the next life won't mean anything to me in this life and vice versa. Something in me kind of does want that. I think that something in everyone wants that continuation of life, but that is distinct from the sense of my personal life, this life that I have shaped, that has been shaped for me, that I value, that this is what we're talking about when we talk about eternal life. Obviously, that's different from conceptions of eternal life, which involve kind of merging back into the one, reuniting with God in the sense of merging back into God and losing one's personal identity. That's a different thing. I think that's much more to do with the life in the first sense, the life force sense of life. But generally, if we're talking about eternal life, especially in this philosophical kind of debate or discussion, and certainly in the Western monotheistic religions, we're talking about this life that I have now. This is the one that's meaningful to me. So we have a kind of tension there. We have a kind of duality there. And I kind of go into this a little bit and say, well, there's a fruitful question that we could ask. We could say, beyond the kind of thought experiments that I talk about in this article or this essay, perhaps the life force in me already expresses itself as different lives. So like I said before, that could look like reincarnation, like actual reincarnation. It could be that actually that life force, there's only one life force uniting all living beings and expressing itself as every individual life, every particular life. So it could be a form of non-dualism. It could also be a Buddhist kind of sense of, well, it's not that there's sort of this substance. It's not like there's this one unitary life force or life substance, but just that life refers to the process of life. And the process of life occurs wherever it occurs. So it occurs in me, it occurs in you, it occurs in me now, it occurred in me 10 years ago, 5 minutes ago. It's not that these are the same, and it's not that these are different. And so the whole sort of same different dichotomy breaks down. Which I think could be really fruitful in thinking about, well, why do we fear death so much? I won't go into that too much now, but this is just, this is just possible places to go with this. The point that I'm making, and let's see, I state this somewhere. Let me see. So we could say one way to put the relation between these two senses of life is life expresses itself as our life. So the life that is fundamental to us, whatever it may be, wants in a sense, or just happens to, by its nature, create these things called lives. And these things called lives are valuable. These individual, particular, precious things which we are, which have limits, which are finite, are valuable. The thing that generates them, the life itself, I think is something that, again, is somewhat impersonal. It just is. And I think that probably it's not so tightly bound to my particular life that it will kind of lasts for as long as it lasts and then disappears or something like that. I think things are much more subtle or interesting than that. But that's just me. It could be the case. But I don't think that would fundamentally change what I'm talking about here. I don't think so anyway. So this is an interesting point as well that I bring up in conclusion. The usefulness of eternal life. I'm not saying that it is useless to have a belief in eternal life. I'm not saying that therefore these people that do believe in eternal life, that it does no good for them at all. I'm not really even saying that it's completely false in a way. So what I am saying is that it's best a belief in eternal life, and I'm talking about personal eternal life. So the very thing that I think is ultimately contradictory, belief in that can actually afford a good finite life. And that comes back to what I was saying before. When I feel like I have nothing to fear, when I don't have to deal with the fear, if I don't have to deal with, for example, the fear of death, or even within life, if I feel like I'm flourishing and I feel like I can kind of trust in life and I have a sense of vitality, and I don't feel like I need to cling to anything, that's when I kind of living my best life. I think that's probably true of everyone. So those are the moments where we are able to kind of let go and be the best people that we can be the most virtuous, be the most attentive. This is kind of a recipe for good life, and the belief in eternal life affords it. So we have this interesting paradoxical relation that a belief in eternal life can afford a really good finite life. It can make things better in the finite lives that we actually live. However, I don't think that that's the last word on that. I agree with Nietzsche that the very same belief, taken in a different way or in a different context or with a different personality, it can afford the very opposite. It can afford a resentful denial of this life, a putting down of this life, a destructiveness that poisons every part of it. So it can have really good effects or it can have really bad effects. If we think about the way that it can afford a good life taken in the right way, I don't really talk about that explicitly in this essay, but I just want to add it here. That suggests to me that in some way, that belief participates, let's say, in truth in a broad sense. So why? Because it enables a right relationship to life, a good and affirmative and correct relationship to life rather than a resentful denial of life. And because it affords that, you could say that it participates in that correctness, that rightness. And so in that sense, it's also right. But in another way, we can sort of look at it more logically and take it apart like we've done, and we come to the same conclusion. Now, I wouldn't write this essay if I thought it was just that, the only thing that could make life rich, the only life that could lead to a good life was a belief in eternal life. Well, pursuing objective truth is important, but maybe I wouldn't publish it, maybe I wouldn't make a video about it. I don't actually think that's the case at all. So I think that you can dispense with this belief in a literal kind of personal eternal life. You can dispense with that, and you can still live a good life, a rich life, a beautiful life. And so I don't fully explain why in here. Maybe I will come back to that in the future. It's also something that I'm still thinking through as well. So it's not fully developed. I think that Nietzsche is helpful here. I think that also there's a lot in the way that I've talked about the two senses of life above or previously. So that's that. Now, I end with this clip from Alan Watts. It's disappeared. It's disappeared from the article, but it should be embedded. It should be embedded there. So I'll have to go back and figure out why it disappeared. Anyway, I've got the transcript of it here. Basically, well, I won't actually. I'll leave it for you to to read it or to watch it, because I don't want to kind of explain. I don't want to kind of reduce it to an explanation because it's, I think, really evocative and really beautiful. But basically, you could take it as being about the fundamental reality expressing itself as the particular human lives, my particular human life, your particular human life, and all its finitude. You could take it as the movement from abstraction back to the same actual life, or you maybe take it as both. I think it's really fruitful, and I think it also somewhat speaks to this kind of question of, well, if there's not a literal personal eternal life, then where are we? Like, can I truly live well? Can I truly have hope? Can I truly experience joy and love and so forth? I think it at least speaks to that. So yeah, I probably have spoken much more than I intended to, and just giving a brief summary. Still, there's much more in the article if you're interested in it and you want to read it. If you have any response to it, feel free to let me know. Feel free to comment. Feel free to give me some feedback, and maybe reach out if you want to have a conversation. I love having conversations with people. So if you disagree with this, or maybe you agree with it and you think that, hey, I thought of this other thing that could be really helpful in thinking about why life is not only livable but valuable, even if it's finite, whatever it is, I'd love to hear it. And I hope that everyone has a fantastic 2025.